kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and forever.
Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the conflict, the heresy of iconoclasm. It may be perhaps the least known yet most influential event in Christian history. Depends on, of course, whose opinion you're looking at. So we're going to try to keep it kind of compact. Let's begin with prayer that is for the evening. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. O Christ, our God, who at all times and in every hour, in heaven and on earth, are worshipped and glorified, who are long-suffering, merciful, and compassionate, who love the just and show mercy upon sinners, who call all to salvation through the promise of the good things to come. O Lord, in this hour, receive our supplications and direct our lives according to your commandments. Sanctify our souls, purify our bodies, correct our thoughts, cleanse our minds, deliver us from all tribulation, evil, and distress. Surround us with your holy angels, so that guided and guarded by them, we may attain to the unity of the faith and to the full knowledge of your unapproachable glory. For you are blessed unto the ages of ages. Amen. So this theme, especially those of you who have been somehow immersed in iconography, or those of you who are Byzantine or Orthodox, the iconoclasm is nothing new. And it is this dark period in history when many of the earliest icons were destroyed, and unfortunately leaving kind of an artistic gap in Eastern Christianity, because Western Christianity was not impacted by iconoclasm, we could say, at least in the destruction of images. Western Christianity, though, was impacted by the iconoclasm in ways which really changed the course of the history of the church. And so we're looking at the period of the 8th century, and beginning in the year 726. In the city of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, although we think of it as being an Eastern reality at this point, the Byzantine Empire technically was also in charge of most of the West. It was still a kind of a loose association, and a Roman Empire that was falling apart in the West, and the East was a little more concerned about its own projects. The Byzantine emperors maintained an outpost in the West. They maintained the city of Ravenna. Ravenna was called the Exarchate of Byzantium. And it was a place where, you could say it was kind of like their embassy for the West. They no longer had a real presence governmentally in Rome. The Pope had kind of assumed a leadership role, at least for Rome and for parts of Italy. And the Byzantines looked at, so let's say the Greeks looked at the Latins, at the Romans, as being kind of backwards. And when, they were interested in Rome when taxes were to be collected, but then when the taxes were dispersed, none of it really went to Rome. And so the city of Rome was in a process of decay. Starting in the 6th century, so already 100 years earlier, the city had neighborhoods which were walled off, and many people lived in constant insecurity. And so much so that even the places where the Roman people went to pray, at the tombs of the martyrs, the catacombs, many of the relics were brought into the city, into the walls, because it was considered unsafe to go outside of the city of Rome. So that sets up a kind of a relationship that's not good between Rome and Constantinople. Now, in Constantinople, there is flourishing, there is money, they are doing quite well. The only thing that seems to be a preoccupation of the emperors is a lack of centralization. So the empire is larger than the rule of the emperor, and the reality of Islam. So if we're looking at 726, so 100 years earlier, in 632, Muhammad dies. And from that point on, Islam is spreading very aggressively through the Middle East, so much so that by the year 640, the countries that we call the Levant are all under Islamic rule. So that includes Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, most of Syria, and also Egypt. By the year 645, the only place where the Byzantine Empire actually has a foothold in what would be called the Middle East is the city of Tripoli in northern Lebanon. And in the year 646, that city too is overtaken by the Muslim invaders from the Arabian Peninsula. And so this reality of Islam is something that is definitely on the minds of the politicians and the rulers of the Byzantine Empire, because they're seeing a significant portion of their empire decimated and being subject to the rule of a people who are not Christian, who have a distorted concept of Christianity, who are using the Quran, which is not the text, not similar to the New Testament. And in the Quran, there are parts which speak about Christians and Jesus and Mary, but the understanding is dramatically different. And so, based on that reality and that threat, it is perhaps possible to think that the Byzantine emperor, by the name of Leo III, he begins the dynasty of the Isaurians. Leo III is a very astute ruler. He rules from 717 until 741. And he is in the tradition of Byzantine emperors, well-educated, a theologian. He knows his stuff. And so he begins this process which becomes known as the Iconoclasm. He inherits a disorganized empire. And one of the things that the Byzantine emperors and people in general, I think we still sometimes do a little bit of that. He looked at the problems around him, and he looked for like a divine reason. it's kind of like, okay, I'm sitting in the middle of this chaos of the Byzantine Empire, with the Muslims attacking the border. What is God trying to tell me? We say that even about the pandemic. A lot of people have said that. What is God trying to tell us? Well, the Byzantine emperors theologized a lot of that because they were well educated. So they saw that perhaps somehow God was offended. And so one of the um, approaches that, that we may find this very hokey, but one of the approaches was he looked at his enemies. And the enemies were, of course, this group of Muslim Arabs who are coming up, from the desert in Arabia, and who are, for all intents and purposes, nomadic. The Arab civilization has not made any great contribution to world civilization at that point. And so he's looking at them. Why are they so successful in attacking us and bringing their faith? And why are we failing? And so this assessment may have brought him to the consideration of they have no images. So they pray, in their Bible, they have some in their Quran, they have some Christian concepts, but they are devoid of any religious imagery. And Leo, with his background also, of course, he would have studied the Old Testament. And so even the understanding of, well, this is not something unique to them, but rather we find this also in the Old Testament and within Judaism, that there is the lack of imagery, of holy images. And so we can, this is one of the problems in doing any sort of research of this type, is that when it comes to what we refer to as like the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, a lot of these heretical movements are known to us primarily through the writings of those who were opposed to them. And so it would be wonderful, it would be a great discovery to find, the actual writings of Leo III that give his theological reasoning for iconoclasm. But we don't have that. We actually find him quoted, and we're hoping that it's a good quote and not really, because you have to kind of take the word of the one who said it. We find his writings quoted somewhat partially in the writings of St. John of Damascus, who was contemporary and defended iconography, and then also in the writings of St. Theodore the Studite. But again, sadly, we don't have his writings to actually know his reasoning and his position. So we have to kind of look at the evidence, and see what he did, and then put it in the light of that period of time, and say, this is probably his mindset as a ruler. So he was actually very successful. He collected taxes well. He built up roads. He did a lot for the empire. And he also ruled a rather lengthy period of time. And so his influence was very good. But of course, in the aftermath of the iconoclasm, no one is going to say that. So nobody gives him credit for any of that. And rather, he is attacked for his bad theology. We give the date of 726 as the beginning of the iconoclasm for a couple of reasons. since he actually began his reign in 717, I think there was a period of kind of studying the situation to see what would be done. But he had his own view, which was not necessarily politically motivated. It probably came out of sincere faith, of trying to figure out, why was God doing this to us? Why were we being punished? He had no doubt. He had also observed the excesses of Constantinopolitan society. Constantinople was a well-to-do city. The royal family was there, not only his family, but a number of other families who had pedigree, families that followed Constantine in the 4th century from Rome to Constantinople, the new capital. And so these families, they had money, they had power, they had clout, and so they paid for the decorations of churches and homes. They loved their images, their icons, the mosaics, so it was a very richly appointed lifestyle that produced icons that were beautiful. You could even say breathtaking, because they represented some of the finest artists of that period, producing images of the saints and Jesus and Mary. And then, of course, there were the ancient icons that were already in the 700s, were 400, 500 years old. We're told about Constantinople having quite a collection of images, icons made by even St. Luke. Constantinople also had relics, and the relic of the true cross. And so all these different things that were in the city, for someone who was a maybe theological purist, who thought about the faith, he may have looked at all of this excess as being idolatrous, and so leading people in the wrong way. Now, Leo also believed that his power and appointment as the Roman emperor, what we would call the Byzantine emperor, he believed that it was divinely appointed, and that his power came directly from God. And that in the Byzantine theology does actually teach that the emperors, including like the czars of Russia, their position was considered an ordination. So they wouldn't have been ordained as priests, but their role in political leadership was on par with the ordination of a bishop or a priest. And so he took his God-given vocation very seriously and saw it as something that he needed to fix and correct. And so he begins this process of purification, of purging of the Byzantine Empire, and he does it in a very measured way. In the year 726, he basically begins cleaning house. And so the cleaning house is creating a system of laws. He wrote a code of law that began a process of removing from public buildings icons or images, be they painted, sculpted, or made of mosaic. And these images, well, they were destroyed, but it was not done in a scandalous way. It was done in a way that was rather succinct, subtle. It was not meant to raise people's alarm, in a sense. This was not an overthrow of everything they were used to. But he put into place also bishops and priests who would support this. So that, and you know, again, we're lacking all his theological treatises about it, but you know, we're led to believe that he had this well thought out and described his theology quite eloquently, as Byzantine emperors were known to do. It seems, though, that as this process of purging went on, that people did begin to react adversely. And so around the year 729, 730, somewhere at that point, there is an order that comes from the emperor confiscating icons and images that people had at home. And so it begins a process, kind of a secondary process. Now, the one who reacts to this, so this is happening primarily based in Constantinople, ripple effect through every Greek-speaking area under the Byzantine emperor. So areas in Greece, what's today like Serbia, Bulgaria, Macedonia. So those areas were also Greek Christian inhabited. Black Sea area, all of Greece, and then all of what's today Turkey. And probably also felt a little bit at the Exarchate of Ravenna and the land that was around it also. The reaction eventually comes to Rome. We don't know who alerted Rome, but somehow they found out in Rome that this was going on, and Pope Gregory III has an immediate reaction condemning the destruction of religious images. And the reaction of Leo, when Pope Gregory expresses his mind about this destruction, reprimanding the Byzantine emperor, the reaction of Leo is to ignore the Pope. And because he already has in the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is his person, and so he's not really worried about this at all. And by ignoring the Pope, Leo causes a schism. And this is it's a small schism, but it kind of sets the standard for what happens in a few other times before we get to the Great Schism. And so from the year 731 until when Leo dies, there is, in a sense, there isn't communion between Rome and Constantinople because of the iconoclasm. And so, but on the upside, Leo, although he is purging the empire of images, he does not persecute people. So there are not people who are being arrested, rounded up, scourged, or even executed because of the iconoclasm. He's still being quite magnanimous and theological. He is looking at his responsibility as not strong-arming the people, but rather correcting their bad theology. And so he begins this process, which becomes the iconoclasm. And the iconoclasm, though, has a rather long history. And so there is, and I'm just going to kind of go through some of those touch points as a point of reference. So Leo III dies in 741, and his son, Constantine V, assumes the throne. Constantine V rules from 741 until 775. Now, if for any of the authors that write about the iconoclasm, any of the fathers that attack the iconoclasm and its leaders, Leo III and Constantine V are kind of the patron saints of this. They're the ones who are generally attacked, even though you've got quite a few more emperors and personalities involved in this. Those two, though, they get blamed for the whole thing because they're the first and second generation of the iconoclasm. Constantine V is actually, and this is another case of the winners of the iconoclasm kind of purging the bad record. So they go and Constantine did a lot for the empire, consolidated power, defended borders. He defended against the Muslim incursions, and Constantine also extended the border of the Byzantine Roman Empire. And so he did a lot, but he's not remembered for any of that. And in all history books, he is given an epithet. And they coined this epithet shortly after his death. He is called Constantine Kopronimos. And literally, it means Constantine the poop head, or the one named poop. So it sounds kind of petty, and the word is a lot ruder than poop, but it is it expresses kind of the historians who are writing about the iconoclasm, their feelings about these emperors, and so he gets this title. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere either. This came out of history, believe it or not. This came out of history because when Constantine V was baptized as a baby, he accidentally, whatever happens with kids, he defecated into the baptismal font. And so they used that to give him the nickname. It's like, yeah, there's no explanation for some of these things in history, but it does make it interesting, and nobody will ever forget him. I mean, there's no other emperor who has that kind of a nickname. But Constantine did actually amp up some of the what we would call persecution of those who, you can call them iconophiles, those who love icons, but they're usually called in Greek iconodules. And those are people who venerate images. And so iconophile means like love images, and it's not exactly the distinction. Venerating images became important because in the definitions of the Council of Nicaea, the Second Council of Nicaea, to address the iconoclasm, the distinction between worship and venerate became very important. And so iconodules are, that would be the more correct title. But Constantine V, he begins this process of very aggressive persecution of the iconodules. He also condemns the cult of saints, and he closes down a lot of the veneration of relics. And so churches that had the bodies of saints, that had pilgrimages, all of that became forbidden. The only image that he permitted And the only relic that he permitted was the cross. And the cross, probably because the relic of the cross is so intimately tied with the city of Constantinople. It was the first relic that was brought to the city of Constantinople. It came directly from the Holy Land with Helena. It's tied to Constantine also. So it's kind of the foundational relic and devotion of the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople. And so that's the one image he doesn't touch. And actually, it is the one image that is then used in churches. Now, we think of so what is happening with the public places having their icons, images removed? They're not necessarily going to a whitewashing. So it is not like, I think we sometimes think of what happened in and after the Protestant Reformation as, all of a sudden taking some of these magnificent decorated buildings, think like, the Belgium, the Netherlands, where you had Gothic buildings with massive altarpieces and a lot of paintings. And then all of a sudden the Reformation comes through and it's now like whitewashed, simple. There's none of that. That wasn't exactly what happened. The issue of images was about like depiction of people, saints, Jesus. And so you still had mosaics going up in churches. They were decorated, though, more floral. And so it was, mosaics done like paradise, so leafy designs, floral designs, and then over the altar or in the dome of the church, the main dome of the church, there was a huge outline of a cross. Usually the cross was all done in gold. And so that was okay. That was permitted. So the churches were still, really beautiful and spectacular. It was just you weren't seeing the images of Jesus and Mary and the saints. So, but Constantine, even in his zeal, though, he took it kind of to the next level because of, and this is where, we'll make a little bit of a connect back to Rome. New emperor, Leo's dead. So Constantine V, his son, is in power. The relationship with Rome, with the Pope, is rekindled. The Pope, however, is quickly informed that nothing has really changed, and actually the iconoclasm has gained speed under Constantine V. However, there isn't anymore he doesn't condemn him. And there's also a change of popes. So the politics maybe also be a little different. But then something huge happens. And that is in the year 751, the Lombards, so they are a Frankish tribe from northern Central Europe. They invade, they're already in northern Italy. They overtake and conquer Ravenna. And so because the Byzantine emperor is so involved in his own thing, 10 years after the death of the previous one, the Pope is frustrated in trying to keep Rome and the western capital of the Roman Empire going. From Ravenna, they're not really getting anything. And so the Pope, in a sense, closed a blind eye to this invasion because previously the Byzantines would defend their territory, but the relationship had become so bad that this was a welcomed invasion. And so having the Lombards come in and then other Frankish tribes follow who fought for them and with them, uh, the Franks were at this point Catholic, they were Christian. So this was not a bad thing. This was kind of, you know, the Pope getting some lemons and making lemonade and devising a plan for a new kingdom. And so this is kind of the beginning of Rome beginning to drift away. In the meantime, the reaction, sadly, the reaction in Constantinople is, no big deal. They're actually not all that disturbed about the loss of Ravenna. Possibly they thought they might regain it at some point. And a new emperor comes into play in the year 775, the grandson. And this emperor is Leo IV. He, interestingly, seems a bit mild on the iconoclast front. And one of the possible reasons for that is that his wife, Irene, is an iconodule. She is known to be a supporter of images and icons. And so, so his attitudes are much more permissive. And he also tries to find ways of reconciling the two parties, because by this point, you're looking already at over 50 years of iconoclasm. So that you're talking minimum 2 generations who have lived under this reality, and they've taken staked claims on opposite sides. Supporting icons in some areas that was okay, and then going against them, the iconoclasts on the other side. So Leo IV tries to reconcile that, and unfortunately his reign is cut short. He rules for 5 years. He dies at the age of 30, leaving behind a 9-year-old son who is Constantine VI. And in the year 780, Irene becomes regent and assumes the title of empress. And she is the one who defends icons. And unlike the images, so Irene appears in many icons, of course, because she brought back iconography. She is, by some, she is canonized, by others, not quite. She is a very strong woman at a time in history when women were not noted for being strong. And so what she does is she rules in place of her son, and she begins immediately by replacing the iconoclast patriarch of Constantinople with a new patriarch who happens to be a layman and her personal secretary. And so he gets ordained kind of fast forwarded in this new career, and is somehow miraculously, when all these bishops come together, elected as a bishop and patriarch of Constantinople. And all that happens within time span of about 5 years. So that's a pretty swift rise in power. So with this patriarch in place, other bishops also in place, and getting rid of some of the controversial iconoclasts, she calls a council to define images and icons and come up with the theology of why we can depict Jesus in his human body, etc., etc. So in the year 786, she calls this council in Constantinople, and unfortunately, there is a revolt against her that happens right there during the council, and it is led by the military. And so the council ends up being canceled or postponed, and she makes another plan. She orders the military garrisons that were behind this attack. She orders them on a campaign to Asia Minor. So Asia Minor is like the eastern part, far eastern part of Turkey. And so they go off on this battle and whatever. When they get there, they're all given their papers and fired. So she did it in style. And she called then again a council, and now she called it in the city of Nicaea for a couple of reasons. Because Constantinople was a hotbed. They had a lot of the influential families, a lot of the military were a part of the whole iconoclast problem. And so she wasn't sure who to trust and who was on her side. Nicaea was a smaller city, although equally important. And then she also probably wanted to build on the fact that Nicaea was the place of the first council. In the year 325, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, where their greatest work was the development of the Nicene Creed. And so I think in a way she saw this as an opportunity to have the council there and then build on that heritage of faith. And so she tried again a year later, in the year 787, in the Council of Nicaea, and the council was rather successful for a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, it gave us all the definitions and explained images and why, gave sound theological wording. And then secondly, Irene, who was a shrewd and very political empress, she also decided to give a couple of incitements to iconoclasts. So she permitted them to repent. And when they would repent, they could remain within their position if they were royalty or if they were working within the state. So a military, a general who was an iconoclast would repent and remain a general. And so that was a very good trade-off. And it was a very smart and astute thing for her to do. The second reason why she did it was that being a woman ruler, and this is an absolute monarch, an absolute ruler, she was in a lonely club of one. There were not other women ruling empires. And so she needed to very smartly think about how to proceed without inciting rage against her. And this seemed to have worked. The problem for Irene, unfortunately, in that later in life, other things don't quite work out well for her. But this part, at least, did. Another thing that happened right at the Council of Nicaea was that she canceled her son's engagement to the daughter of Charlemagne. These are things which will be coming up again because they impact East-West relations. And so Charlemagne was kind of at this point, 787, he was an ambitious leader who had emperor and empire aspirations. So he was hoping that everything was going to work out good, but things were still like in the works. And so Irene kind of thought, well, that's he's not going to make it. He's never going to be someone, and so she kind of didn't take him seriously, and then canceled the engagement. And that was at that time a major offense. That was something that Charlemagne would accept with, I think, a very heavy heart. Now, the other problem that happens in this time is that in the year, so the council 787, in 790, her and Leo's son, becomes eligible to rule. He is no longer a minor. And so there's a little bit of I guess you could say, some speculation as to what happens. But her son, at some point, is attacked and he is blinded. A lot of historians think this was done by her people, her henchmen, or her supporters, and it's something that I think of many people when they read this part of history. Why would a very pious woman who is bringing back iconography and images and getting all the theologians and bishops and patriarchs together, to teach the faith, why would she go and then have her son blinded? Well, historians think that, generally speaking, if it wasn't from her, then he might have been killed. Whereas as a mother, she realized that blinding him would not kill him. He would still live and be productive, but he could no longer rule because he couldn't see. And so it was a way of, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so this is, I think this is one of those cases of, she was, at one point, she was sincere, motivated by faith and by love for God. But then at some point, it became distorted and changed. Now, that's one of the reasons why she is generally not recognized as a saint, because of this episode casts a shadow over her rule and her judgment. A part of this also goes, so there are other things that happen. Irene also is dealing with Charlemagne since the marriage fell apart. And Charlemagne does things that are considered treasonous. So firstly, he approaches the Pope, and the Pope willingly crowns him as Roman Emperor in the year 800. And this is the moment when we could say officially the Roman Empire dies. So, technically speaking, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was functioning well and had the Western Empire kind of in pieces parts. So they weren't really supporting it for the last 200 years. So it was already kind of semi-autonomous, floating away. But this was the point when the Pope saw an opportunity to break with Constantinople once and for all and bring in a powerhouse. The Franks were very powerful. They had a large army that served and fought very well, and they came with money, and they wanted to be like the Byzantines. These were a bunch of, using the historical terminology, the Greeks and even some of the Roman Latin families that were still in Rome, they looked at the Franks and they were like, these people are barbarians. This was how they were called normally. It wasn't an insult. They were just barbarians. And so they looked down on the Franks and on Charlemagne. But the Pope saw that the rulers, the leaders of the Franks, they wanted to have legitimacy. They wanted to be like the ancient Romans. They wanted to be the Caesar. They wanted to be Byzantine. And, because that was a heritage to aspire to. And so the Pope welcomed this invasion, much to the criticism of many of his own people, because, of course, they weren't happy about, all these foreigners and barbarians taking over everything. And of course, it meant also a change in the church. In order to have all of these people now ruling the West, bishops had to be put in place who were Frankish, who were from that background. And so all of this was a little messy. So in Constantinople, they called this, they called Charlemagne a traitor. This was treacherous because he had assumed a title that did not belong to him. Now, he didn't really assume it. The Pope crowned him in St. Peter's Basilica, old St. Peter's Basilica at that time, in the year 800, and gave him the title of Roman Emperor. So it wasn't something that he made up. I mean, he wanted it really bad, but it was conferred upon him. Irene was criticized that she did nothing to condemn that. She sent no one there to protest this. There was no ramifications on Rome. And actually, before the year 800, so a couple of other things happened. Irene became very lax in enforcing tax codes. And so the money flow into Constantinople was beginning to dry up. And because of her, perhaps it was motivated by fear, she did not aggressively pursue the money that belonged to the empire, nor Charlemagne. And then to make things really shady and dicey, Charlemagne proposed to Irene. So talk about a turn of tables. This reads like some Mexican telenovela. It's like a soap opera. What does this do to Irene's reputation? Well, she probably considered it, because this was no longer going to be a marriage to produce an heir. That was over for both of them. And so this was going to be the unification of the empire. And that's, Charlemagne wanted to get all the rights of Byzantium under him. And she considered it, because we're told that there was a rather lengthy period of no response. And so she did consider it, because her power was also waning. She was, after what happened with her son, his blinding, there were some people, some factions turning against her. And so, of course, the iconoclasm was over and all this, but people were turning against her. And then the worst part of this was that when word got out, even though she refused Charlemagne's offer or proposal, when word got out that he had proposed to her and that she had even considered it, that led to her overthrow, because they considered that to be an insult. They considered her to be powerless. Instead of pursuing him and not recognizing him as emperor, here she had entertained accepting his proposal. And so Irene ends up being overthrown in the year 802 by the next emperor, who was a military leader, Nikephoros. And Nikephoros ruled shortly, 802 to 811. And he ruled very aggressively. As a military leader, he recognized the instability of the empire. He focused, one of his main tasks was to balance the iconodules and iconoclasts so that they wouldn't, it wouldn't ignite into a war. And he also reasserted the control over larger territories, areas that had fallen away during the rule of Irene, although Ravenna was never recovered. And so, so his short rule did stabilize things, but he was followed. He had a daughter, and her husband became Emperor Michael I, and he ruled a short 2 years. And you could tell already now with the emperors being shorter duration that something was brewing. And all of that comes to a head in the year 813, when Leo the Armenian assumes power. And he is a full-blooded, crazy iconoclast. So the iconoclasm never went away. And one of his issues, he has an experience of having grown up in the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire, in an area where there was a lot of commerce at the border with the Muslims. So historians think that one of his motivating factors was a close knowledge of Muslim teachings. And so taking, so it's again kind of rearing its ugly head, the same thing of trying to find some sort of a religious middle ground that makes Christianity look similar to Islam in some ways. And so he reinstitutes what is called the Second Iconoclast Era. And so he rules from 813 to 820. And one of his main, what he props his, and it's a persecution at this point of the iconodules, of the different defenders, the monks, especially monasteries, were charged under Irene with painting of icons and restoring a lot of what had been lost. And Leo goes on an all-out rampage against these monastics, monks and nuns, and thousands of them flee from the Byzantine Empire to the west. Immigrating, many of them immigrated to Italy, which is why we find so many beautiful icons from this period made by Greek monks from southern Italy all the way up. And but Leo the Armenian is an unpopular outsider, and he ends up being killed by other iconoclasts who want a different emperor. And so, and these iconoclasts, get a load of this. This is really great stuff. He goes to church, and his assailants, they dress up as the choir, and they go to church and they kill him. He dies in church, and Michael II assumes power. And again, this is another crazy iconoclast. And at this point, the second wave of iconoclasts, you wonder if it disappeared at all, if under Irene, maybe that theology was just hidden away somewhere. Because the way that it reemerges, it's really, really strong and destructive. So Michael II assumes power, and he enforces the ban on all icons. He does lighten the persecution against the iconodules. And then finally, he is followed by Emperor Theophilus from the years 829 until 842. And he institutes, Theophilus, another wave of persecution. What happens, though, is that Theophilus' wife is a woman named Theodora, who again is known as being very sympathetic to images, artists, and icons. And when Theophilus dies, he leaves behind a 3-year-old son named Michael III. And so when Theophilus dies, and this is a familiar pattern, Theodora becomes regent. And so she rules as Empress Theodora in place of her son Michael III until he is of age. Things are different, though. Theodora is, she is canonized. She is recognized as a saint. And Theodora inherits a different empire than Irene. Prior, this period of the last 3 emperors, who were rather short-lived and who were very aggressive, was also a period of natural disasters in the empire, as well as significant military incursions and a loss of land. And so she took the same approach, and talk about coming full circle. She took the same approach of Leo III at the very beginning, and she pointed out to the people of the empire, to her advisors, to the leaders, the religious leaders. She said, look, we are being punished for what we have done. We had the council, and it was rejected, and God is now expressing his wrath and anger about this through what is happening in the empire. And that seemed to be good enough for most people. So they got behind her and supported her. And then she also, there was a rumor that was spread that Theophilus, her husband, who ruled not the shortest period, but a little bit, and did some good. Theophilus this was a rumor, that he had repented on his deathbed of the iconoclasm. And so that was also used to kind of steady her claim on the throne and on this new trajectory of taking the council and returning it back to its placement within the canon of church councils. And so she replaced the iconoclast patriarch And the iconoclast patriarch was a man named John the Grammarian. He was very well-known speaker and writer and theologian. So, this was someone who was very qualified to defend the iconoclasm from a theological perspective. But she successfully deposed him and replaced him. And on the first Sunday of Lent in the year 843, the iconoclasm officially ended. And the effects, what effects came? Well, she just reinstated again the original council from 787. It was proclaimed again as being the official teaching of the church. And she also changed one thing that kind of, at least for the Eastern churches, became a big deal. She turned over a lot of the leadership as bishops, but even as priests and pastors, to monastics. Because one of the things that she saw that the bishops and patriarchs and pastors who were secular, so not from a monastery, that they were somehow more politically involved. And so they could be bribed, they could be controlled by the politics of the royal court. And so, and that's one of the reasons why, within the Orthodox Church specifically today, there's a very strong tradition of monastics becoming the leaders, becoming the bishops of the church. And that's something that comes from that period. Now, the other impact, so this, I said at the beginning, that this is probably one of the most significant historical periods and events in Christian history that is unknown to most Christians, because Rome was kind of involved from the side. So the Pope would send condemnation after condemnation of iconoclast teaching, but he was really impotent as far as being able to directly intervene. So he only had that one period of communion being pulled, but other than that, he wasn't excommunicating them. He wasn't doing anything that would perhaps even have some greater ramification. I think one of the issues is that the relationship between the East and West. Rome was Latin speaking at this point. A lot of the dialects were coming into greater power, such as what would become Italian and French. Those languages were developing, as did Spanish also. And so they're in a different cultural orbit than the church using Greek. And in the city of Constantinople, everything was in the empire was being done in Greek, with a couple of things done in Latin, because the Byzantine Empire, until its fall in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, the Byzantine Empire did not call itself the Byzantine Empire. It did not call itself the Christian Empire of the East. It called itself the Roman Empire. And as far as, who had claim to being the continuation of the Roman Empire, from considering like the time of Constantine, but even before, the only one who really did have a direct line was the Byzantine Empire, because there it was actually founded as part of the Roman Empire. And then with the coronation of Charlemagne in the West, it was already a different entity. It was no longer that same empire, and that bloodline was gone. And so this event, though, is very influential for a number of reasons, because we have that one attempt where Irene and Charlemagne could have gotten married, and I think the world as we know it, the Christian world, would be completely different. That's guaranteed. But that didn't happen. So that's a significant historical hiccup right there. And then the other thing, because of this rejection, Charlemagne and the Pope begin to develop a significantly different Western empire that becomes kind of the foundation for Western European civilization. And so it's a new thing. It's no longer, the Roman Empire. It has a completely different construct. When I talk about what leads up to the Great Schism between East and West, and the mutual excommunications, and all of that, which then distinguish Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and what that means. This was kind of that first point. Charlemagne here, he is empowered as emperor to begin to imitate some of the things that the Constantinople crowd did. So the Byzantine emperors, they were theologians. So they wrote treatises. They defended the faith. So he begins to emulate this. The Byzantine emperors, they wrote laws. They threw the councils. This was their thing to do. So he begins to emulate that also. He comes up with his own version of laws, and also canon law. And so these things, they begin to kind of light a fire that begins the conflict between East and West. And the things that Charlemagne defends. So Charlemagne picks up one of the big hot topics, which was the filioque, the addition into the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed of the Word and the Son. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, is the way it is in the original creed. And however, beginning in the 7th century in Spain, as a way of addressing Arianism and semi-Arianism, so the phrase filioque was added. So the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That was rejected initially, even by the Pope. And however, it ended up under Charlemagne, it became one of his causes. He picked it up as like a theological thing against Constantinople. They talk about the complex of the jilted bride, but I think he's kind of feeling a bit jilted himself, both for his daughter as well as then for himself when Irene rejects him. So he's getting back at her, I think, through some good old-fashioned theology. And so the filioque becomes a theme. The other theme that he also picks up is the use of leavened versus unleavened bread for liturgy, for Mass, because that was a big controversy too. And so these things, as well as some other smaller ones, they figure importantly in the development from this point. So the iconoclasm kind of brought out the ugly, and then everything else just went crazy. You might think, well, with the popes, especially after the year 1000, the popes seemed to be involved in everything. They were crowning kings, they were approving, who was going to be ruling over what. They settled disputes, they arranged marriages, they made sure that the bloodline continued, and so they were really like in everything. And so, I think one of the things is, well, why weren't they so involved in this whole thing in Constantinople? Why didn't they, excommunicate somebody? They seem to be so like cool when it comes to the iconoclasm, which literally raged on for 150 years. And so I think that one of the things to remember in this whole setting is that because the Greeks had already kind of abandoned Ravenna and left Italy to its own devices, so the reaction from Rome was that when there was a problem in Constantinople and in the Byzantine Empire, so they looked at it from Rome as, just the Greeks doing the crazy things the Greeks do. And so they ignored it. And we see some of that come out then in the theological squabbles, which in a way it's funny because like when the Greeks make the accusations about, filioque and this and that, the Romans, and they're ascending at this point in the 800s. The Pope's power is growing. Now he's got the Franks around him, and also the Frankish rulers, they rule over most of Europe. Their influence goes all the way up to Scandinavia and into the British Isles. So there's a lot of power to be had. And so the popes, the roles are reversed. As the Greeks yell and scream and write treatises against what the Latins are doing, the popes are kind of like, who cares? They're just ignoring them. And that drives the Greeks crazy too, because the Greeks were used to being taken so seriously. If they cried heresy, everybody jumped. That was no longer the case. And so all of that just kind of adds then to this tension that it's an interesting mix of theology with some cultural undertones and some politics. It's not as much politics as you would think, though. That's the funny thing is that, at the end of the first wave of iconoclasm, instead of like having some sort of a military crackdown, they throw a party at the council, and it kind of brings everything together. It reminds, the Byzantine outlook is always somehow theological, and the politics seem to take a second place to it. But nonetheless, it's still it's an event that really does rock the foundation of Christianity and set up certain things that will continue really well into the future. Don't think that Christians, Catholics during the Reformation weren't somehow thinking about the iconoclasm. It seemed a little familiar to them what they were going through. But I think that the Reformation also had much more of a political undertone than the iconoclasm did. But still, it's interesting. The history does have a way of somehow kind of repeating itself. So anyway, that is my introduction to this chaotic period in church history. An important period. You can, if you have any questions, please ask now. Ask away. effectively from, around 500 on, the ultimate civil authority in Rome and in what was called kind of the papal lands, the ultimate civil authority was the Pope. So he was both a religious leader as well as um, a, civic leader. This is before Pepin. Remember that Rome was left to its own devices. It was not being defended, and the Pope had to assemble an army to defend the city of Rome from the invasions of different peoples, the Avars, the Visigoths, the Huns. I mean, there are many who were coming and trying to get into Rome. And so his leadership at this point was quite direct and intentional. It was no longer really an appointed leadership. There are also, as far as the approval of the Byzantine emperor, there's some elections had the participation of the emperor, and some didn't. We see that in Constantinople. So it just kind of depends on the emperor's own disposition towards the church. And so if he saw that, because the other thing, remember, the emperors were also educated by the patriarchs. So we see, like in the 9th century, the son of Theodora, who brought back the veneration of icons, Michael III was educated by Patriarch Photius, and there was a closeness between him as well as Photius and other very influential people who were part of the kind of a revival, Renaissance in the Byzantine Empire post Iconoclasm. So it's a case by case. It's not a general rule. I think that the iconoclasm wasn't necessarily forced aggressively on the people. It was part of a process that included education, that included also, forming people to an understanding that what the emperor thought, Leo thought that, the empire was slowly losing to the Muslims because they worshipped icons. And there were abuses. There were a lot of abuses. We know of, for example, we know in provincial, so not in Constantinople, but in parts of Greece that were under the Byzantine Empire, there were cases in the 7th century of people choosing a miraculous icon as a godparent. This is idolatry. This is like they're literally falling back on some pagan understanding of image. And so the excesses were there. We know about the excesses, by the way, only because in local church councils, we have preserved laws, canon law, that says an icon cannot be a godparent. When you find laws like that, it means that that was happening. Well, and that is iconoclasm. That's one of the things that, like right before the beginning of the iconoclasm, I think it was Justinian II, he made a law that Jesus could only be depicted in his human form. Because that is what was seen. He assumed human form so that he could be visible and touchable and described, and look just like we do. And so Justinian took that as, Justinian II took that as kind of a theological platform. And he said that, so any symbolic representation of Jesus, so like, for example, Jesus as a cross that is lit or whatever with jewels. That was not permitted. It had to directly depict his human face, and his way of affirming that was that he put the image of Jesus on his coinage, and it was on the head side of the coin. Even the other emperors had their faces on the head side of the coin, but he put Jesus's there. So, there was something going on. This is maybe 40 years before the iconoclasm. And so there's something happening theologically that, would have caused him to emphasize the focus on the human face of Christ. What it is, we don't know. Did it lead to the iconoclasm? Yeah, probably. It's a longer problem brewing, and it just kind of gets its apex with Leo. Leo is the one who actually begins this whole event. Actually, most of Ravenna is intact. There wasn't none of the destruction made it to Ravenna. Probably reason number one is because by the year 751, it was no longer under Constantinople. So it was removed within 25 years of the beginning of the iconoclasm. It was already taken away from the direct government of Constantinople. So that's one reason. There we can see what Byzantine art in Constantinople was like before the iconoclasm. Now, going back to some of the monuments from the Byzantine era, pre-iconoclasm, there is also, if you want to look up, there is the Rotunda of St. George in Thessaloniki that survived. Thessaloniki was the second city of the Byzantine Empire for the longest time. And so it's interesting that where Constantinople, there was total destruction. We really don't have any leftovers. You can go to Thessaloniki and find a lot of mosaics that survived. So there, the Church of St. Demetrius, the Basilica of St. Demetrius in Thessaloniki, and then there are a couple of other sites. But it's impressive to see, again, Constantinopolitan workmanship. So it's not a provincial thing. Ravenna was directly dependent on Constantinople, as was Thessaloniki. So when they decorated the churches, they brought the artists from Constantinople. So you're seeing the absolute best, and a little glimpse of the splendor that must have been at one time, like Hagia Sophia, when it was originally filled with mosaics. Because what we see there today is post-iconoclasm. And so it's a little different. If you have any questions, just let me know. You can even ask me next week if you want. So, see you next week.
Blessed is the kingdom of the